What if I told you you're not stuck with your past? We're taught that time only flows forward, but what if your consciousness could reach back and reshape a moment that already happened, and in doing so completely alter the trajectory of your future? It sounds wild, but there's a powerful manifestation technique that suggests that this might be possible. And even more mind-blowing, there's an experiment in quantum physics that suggests that this influence on the past might be literal. My name's Georgia. I have a master's degree in consciousness, spirituality and transpersonal psychology, and in my free time I love to research manifestation and the science behind shifting our reality. Now, in today's video, we're going to be exploring a very intriguing manifestation technique, and that is revision. This isn't just about setting an intention for the future, it's about something far more radical. Mentally rewriting a past event, and in doing so, reshaping the timeline that flows from it. And if that sounds far-fetched, stay with me, because there's a mind-blowing experiment in quantum physics that suggests that this might not be just a metaphor, it might be something that's literally possible. So first, what is revision? So revision is a very interesting manifestation technique that was proposed by Neville Goddard, and it's based on the profound idea that you are not bound by your past because your past isn't fixed. It lives only in your imagination, and so as a result it can be changed. You can select a new timeline in which your ideal version of the past actually occurred, and as a result you change the future to be in line with what you want because the future stems from the past. Think of it like a film playing on a projector. Most people think they're just watching the movie, but you are the projector. You can move the reel backwards or change the reel altogether, and as a result, the entire film that plays after will shift. Let's look at this in more detail. In Neville's teachings, the outer world is simply a reflection of your inner assumptions and imaginal acts. So when you revise the past internally, reality, like a mirror, reshapes to match. In other words, your current experiences are shadows of your past beliefs, thoughts and experiences. There's a delay between what you imagine and what materializes. So if you revise the past in your imagination, you are changing the seed that the future grows from. And here's where it gets powerful. When you truly feel that the revised version is real, when it replaces the emotional charge of the old event, then the future that stems from that past begins to change. What you feel is real now is the cause of the future. So how do you revise? It's actually quite simple. At night, before you go to sleep, when your subconscious mind is most open, replay your day in your imagination, but don't replay it as it actually happened. Instead, take any event that you didn't like an argument, a mistake, a missed opportunity, and replay it how you wish it had happened. Visualize the most ideal version of those events. Now, the key thing to note about this process is it's not about the visual, it's about the feeling. You need to feel these events as if they actually happened. So feel the relief, feel the joy, feel the satisfaction until it sinks in that it's real. This is what Neville called the feeling of the wish fulfilled. You need to feel like these events that you're curating in your imagination actually did happen, that they were actually fulfilled. When you revise a memory vividly and emotionally and truly accept it as real, you're selecting a different timeline. One where the past event unfolded in the way that you imagined. So let's look at a few examples of this. Let's imagine that earlier in the day you got something out of the oven and you burned yourself. So when you are laying down to go to sleep and about to do your revision, what you want to imagine instead is you getting that food out of the oven, doing it calmly and obviously not burning yourself, putting your food on your plate with no pain and then actually enjoying your meal. And the idea here is that if you do this revision successfully, if you get to a point where you actually feel that that reality was real, and it might take a couple of nights to get to that point, but if you do get to that point, the idea is that the future now, your current experience and the experience stemming from that should shift in line with the reality that you just revised. So maybe that burn that you have starts to heal really, really quickly as if it never happened. Now, another example would be, let's imagine you had a really bad argument with someone earlier in the day. When you're coming to revise this, then you want to imagine obviously having a calm conversation with that person, having a peaceful conversation, and maybe not necessarily them just blindly accepting your point, but at least having a constructive conversation where you can both come to an agreement and be respectful towards each other. And again, the idea here would be, if you revise this successfully, then maybe that person will reach out to you as if nothing ever happened, or maybe if you choose to reach out to them, then they'll be completely receptive to that and there'll be no animosity there, and it'll be like you never had an argument in the first place. So the idea here is that whatever actually happened in the past doesn't matter. When it comes to the future and what we're going to experience which stems from the past, the physical past that you experience doesn't matter. What matters is the past that you believe in your imagination. If you can create a new scenario and make it feel completely real in your head, then that is what matters, and that is what the future is going to stem from. So this manifestation technique leads us to some very interesting questions. Specifically, does revision have a literal effect on the past? In other words, can our consciousness actually influence past events? It sounds impossible, but quantum physics suggests that this might actually be possible, and we're now going to explore why. So before we go on to the specific experiment that implies that revision might actually be a real phenomenon, we first need to understand a bit of background information. So I'm going to just very briefly outline another quantum physics experiment, because without this background it's going to be a little more tricky to understand the experiment that we're actually going to be looking at. So first we need to understand that there was an experiment in quantum physics called the double slit experiment, and essentially what happened in this experiment is they were sending quantum particles through a wall with two slits in, and they were interested in what pattern was going to emerge on a screen. Now, what they found is that quantum particles essentially behave very weirdly. So when these particles are not observed, they exhibit some very weird behavior as if they're behaving like waves. So essentially, when they weren't being observed, quantum particles would produce something called an interference pattern. Now, this pattern is a specific pattern that emerges when waves interfere with each other. So imagine a wave going through two slits. The wave is going to go through both of the slits and then interfere with itself on the other side to create an interference pattern, which is essentially just like a striped pattern. So quantum particles, which aren't waves, at least not that we thought, seem to produce this interference pattern in this experiment when they're not being observed. So it's like the particles are going through both slits at the same time and interfering with themselves to create an interference pattern. Now, on the other hand, as soon as these particles are observed, they suddenly start behaving like particles again. So they produce a pattern that we would have expected in the first place, as if they are individual particles like we would expect. So when they're not observed, these particles behave like waves and create an interference pattern, and when they are observed, they behave like particles and create what's called a clump pattern. Now, this phenomenon is known as the observer effect. However, despite its name, it's not necessarily got anything to do with a conscious observer. What's actually happening in the experiment is whether a measurement is being taken. So it's the act of taking a measurement that causes this transformation from a quantum particle from behaving like a wave to behaving like a particle. Now, no one knows why the act of taking a measurement seems to have this effect, so there are some interpretations of quantum physics which do think it has something to do with a conscious observer. Now, if you want to know more about this experiment and its implications for manifestation, then I'll link a video down below that goes into it in detail, and I'll also link the video here as well, so you can watch that after if you are intrigued. But for now, we can move on to the experiment we're interested in this video, which is all about whether there are influences that can go backwards in time. Now, the experiment I'm talking about is called the delayed choice quantum eraser. And what happens in this experiment is this time we have a pair of entangled photons. So photons are a quantum particle, specifically they're a particle of light. And here we have a pair of them that are entangled. Now, the term entangled refers to something called quantum entanglement, and what it means when two quantum particles are entangled is that their properties are linked. So the state of one directly correlates to the state of the other. So, for example, if we have a pair of quantum particles that are entangled, if one of them is in the state of behaving like a wave, then the other one also has to be in that state. Now, if a measurement is taken on one of those particles and causes it to collapse, like we already discussed, causes it to transform from being in that wave-like state to being in a particle state, then that measurement, despite only being on that one particle, will also cause the other particle to collapse because they're both entangled. So the key thing you need to understand here is simply that their states are correlated. So what happens in the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment is, again, we have a wall that has two slits in. Let's label them as slit A and slit B. Now there is a laser, and this laser is going to send the pair of entangled photons through either slit A or slit B. And what's important here is that we don't know which slit the pair of photons is going to be sent through. Now, when the pair is fired through one of these two slits, what's going to happen is there's going to be a prism, and it's going to cause this pair of photons to split in different directions. So one of the photons is going to go up towards a detector called D0. Now what we need to note here is that the photon that ends up at D0 is going to end up there first. So it's going to reach that detector before its entangled photon reaches another detector lower down in the setup. We'll come back to that in a minute. But this photon that ends up at D0 is going to get there first, and we don't know whether it came from path A or path B, because both paths A and B can lead to D0. So because we don't know which path it came from, it should produce an interference pattern, like in the double slit experiment that we already talked about. In theory, the photon should behave as if it's gone through both slits, like a wave, because we haven't measured which one it's gone through, so it should produce an interference pattern. Now let's ignore that photon for a minute and instead look at the second photon, the one it is entangled with. So this second photon is going to end up at one of 4 other detectors. So now we have detectors D1, D2, D3 and D4. And now what we have to understand is that if this second photon ends up at D3 or D4, then we know which path it came from. If it ends up at D3, for example, then it must have come from path B, because the only way to get to this detector, D3, is via path B. However, if the photon ends up at D4, then we know it must have come from path A, because the only way to get to that detector is through path A. You'll see that there are some screens in this experimental setup which deflect the photons to these 2 points. Now, these screens, essentially the photons have a 50-50 chance of either bouncing off of them or going through them. And this is what's key to understanding the next 2 points, D1 and D2. If the photon ends up at D1 or D2, then we don't know which path it came from. This is because both paths A and B can end up at both of these detectors. And again, this comes back to the fact that we have these screens that the photons can either bounce off of or pass straight through. Due to the way that the experiment is set up, with these screens, the photons from both path A and path B can go via different routes to end up at both of these detectors. So if it ends up at D1 or D2, we have no idea if it came from path A or path B. Now you may have already guessed this, but when the photon ends up at D3 or D4, the detector always picks up a clump pattern. Now, a clump pattern is what happens when a particle is behaving like a particle. We already discussed this in the context of the double slit experiment. When a particle is observed or measured, it produces a clump pattern. It behaves as if it is a particle, and this is exactly what's happening here. However, when the photon ends up at D1 or D2, where we don't know the path information, we always get an interference pattern as if the particles are behaving like waves. So again, this corresponds to the double slit experiment. When the particles are not observed or measured, they behave like waves, producing interference patterns. And again, this is what's happening here when we don't know the path information. So it's like a measurement hasn't been taken in that sense, but in this case, it's more referring to our knowledge of the system setup. But what's really mind-blowing and what links this experiment to revision is what happens to our original photon at D0. So we already talked about how the 2 photons are entangled, so the state of the one at D0 should correlate to the state of the other photon, whichever detector it's at. And this is exactly what happens. If the second photon ends up at D3 or D4, where we get a clump pattern, D0 also shows a clump pattern. But if the second photon ends up at D1 or D2 and we get an interference pattern, we also get an interference pattern at D0. So their states are correlated as we would expect because they're entangled. But if you remember, what's very interesting here is the photon at D0 got there first. It reached D0 before its entangled photon reached the other detector, and yet it always produced the same pattern as its entangled twin. So there are 2 key points that emerge from this experiment. The first one is retrocausality. It's like the first photon knew what we'd find out later. It's as if the knowledge of the path information travelled back in time and altered the outcome. So some interpretations of quantum physics support this idea that in this experiment there really is an influence going back in time. So it also links to the idea that time is just illusion and it doesn't just travel forward. But I do have to mention here, like with any experiment in quantum physics, because really it's all just a mystery, there are other interpretations such as the many worlds interpretation that do not require backward causality in this experiment. But simply understanding that there are some models that do accept that there really could be some backward influences happening here is already mind-blowing. Now the second key point to emerge from this experiment has everything to do with knowledge. The fact that the outcome of the experiment seems to be linked to the knowledge of the path information and the experimental setup seems to imply that this could have something to do with consciousness, because what does knowledge require? It requires a knower, and that implies a conscious observer. Like I already alluded to, there are some interpretations of quantum physics which suggest that consciousness itself can influence the behaviour of particles at the quantum level. Now, if we take that kind of interpretation to be true, then this experiment would suggest that not only can consciousness affect the behaviour of quantum particles, but it can also maybe even affect the past. Now, if the interpretations that support retrocausality are true, then revision might be more than simply using your imagination. It might really involve some kind of time influence. You might not be just visualizing a new past and making it feel real. You might be literally altering the past or creating new branches of reality based on that revised information. So tonight, before you go to sleep, try this. Pick a moment from your day that you wished had happened differently. Close your eyes and imagine it unfolding exactly how you wish it happened. Feel it, believe it, and accept it as real, because your imagination is the blueprint and your reality is the shadow that it casts. So we've just explored the mind-blowing concept of retrocausality and how it relates to manifestation. Now, if you want to explore an equally mind-blowing link to manifestation, you can watch this video next. Here I use quantum physics to suggest that multiple possible realities might already exist, and your job is simply to shift into the one you want to experience. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and I hope to see you in the next one.